Greetings all, Ferrari601 here. As a follow-up to the now somewhat successful video that I made about 6 months ago about my submersible sinking Titanic model, I've got this. These are two 1/1000th scale replicas of Olympic-class ocean liners, namely the RMS Olympic and the RMS Titanic. These models are the first ship models that I've gotten in many, many years, and the moment I saw them, I absolutely had to get them. Interesting story behind why they exist at all. These models are done by the Titanic Honor and Glory guys. They are currently developing a video game which has as its main purpose to recreate in as unbelievably precise and accurate and complete detail as is humanly possible the RMS Titanic inside and out. Basically, what this development team has as their mission is to rebuild the Titanic pretty much rivet by rivet in virtual reality, in the virtual space of video games. And what they want to do is turn it into a playable video game, but they're also approaching it from the standpoint of history. They're trying to create something that's going to be interactive, but complete, detailed, and as accurate as humanly possible as a way of preserving the memory of Titanic and the Olympic-class ships, as well as continuing that story forward, as now, of course, there is nobody left alive who was on the Titanic who survived the obvious disaster that's quite well known. And obviously, when we talk about history, historical events, the only way that we can learn about them is if they're remembered. So that is what the Titanic Honor and Glory guys are doing. And of course, if you're interested in that project, a link in the description. But we're not talking about those guys necessarily today. What we're doing is talking about these two absolutely fantastic models of RMS Olympic and RMS Titanic. For literally as long as I can remember, I have been absolutely captivated by the stories of these ships. Of course, Titanic is extremely famous today because of the sinking which occurred on its first and only trip across the Atlantic between the British Isles and New York. But for me, Titanic and that story, they were the first real, intense, nagging interest that I developed in my entire life, and it's something that has just always resonated with me, and I can't entirely explain why. Perhaps it's reincarnation, perhaps it's karma, whatever you want to talk about, but I've always had quite a visceral connection to the story of the Titanic and its sister ships, and perhaps there is something to be investigated there in the realm of metaphysics. However, for those of you who might not be entirely familiar, RMS Titanic, seen here on the right-hand side, and you can see one of its tender ships that we'll talk about in a moment as well. A British passenger liner built between 1909 and 1912. It was owned and operated by the White Star Line out of Liverpool, England. These ships were very commonplace at the turn of the 20th century. Remember, aircraft had only been invented about 10 years prior to this. Remember, we're in 1912 when we're talking about Titanic. So, the way to get across oceans was not to fly, it was to take a ship, quite obviously. Aircraft could only fly for short times. By this point, they had improved quite a lot in the 9, 10 or so years that they had been around ever since the Wright brothers first flew at Kitty Hawk. But by far the most efficient and reliable way to transport people and goods between continents was by ship. And this brings us into the age of the great ocean liners at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. And of course, Olympic and Titanic are great examples of the era of the great ocean liner. All of your major European powers operated shipping companies. Some were government-owned, some were private. Of course, you had the United Kingdom operating companies both privately and publicly in terms of government ownership. You had France, you had Germany, Prussia at the time. So really, this was an international affair. Of course, there were several American and Canadian shipping companies as well, but this was how commerce was done. This is how travel was done. Basically, if you had business that needed to happen on two continents, ships were the lifeline in all of it. Of course, the situation really hasn't changed much today. It's just that we use different modes of transport, but if you've got business in different places, you need to travel, and this is how people were traveling at the beginning of the 20th century on ships quite like these. Of course, what one has to remember as well when we're talking about this is there was nothing particularly remarkable about either of these two ships, and really none of the others that were its counterparts and its contemporaries in this era. These ships were basically 747s or Airbus A380s of their time. They were a means to an end. If you needed to cross an ocean, this was something that you needed to get on in order to do it. Of course, with the story of Titanic, with the disaster which occurred on its first and only trip, Titanic has become extremely famous and extremely well known nowadays, but in their era, these would have been commonplace sights in port cities around the world. It's no different than an airport is for us today. If you see an aircraft flying over your house, it's that common a sight going back 100 years or so. So that sets the perspective in terms of why these ships existed and what they were used for, and generally trying to dispel some of the ideas that now exist about the sort of rose-colored, romanticized notion of what this era was and what was actually happening. These were simply a means to an end. Nonetheless, they were very, very cool means to an end, I must say. The two ships seen here, RMS Olympic and RMS Titanic. First, to explain the names. RMS, that is a prefix that is assigned to a ship which is contracted by the Royal Mail. That is the mail delivery of the United Kingdom, the whole mail service there. These ships would have been trusted by the British government to carry mail and thereby the business of the United Kingdom. So to have RMS as a title on your ship was certainly something quite prestigious. That is why Olympic and Titanic are officially known as RMS Olympic or Titanic. They had that contract from the Royal Mail to carry post and packages across the seas. Very cool. You may also see these ships' names rendered as SS Olympic or Titanic. SS simply means steamship. Quite obviously, and we'll get into this in a moment, these were steam ships. Internal combustion engines did exist at this time, and some of them actually were quite large and were already making their ways into ships, but steam engines were a much older technology, much more robust, reliable, tried and true method of moving big things over long distances. So Olympic and Titanic had steam engines, and we'll get into some of the specifications on these ships in just a moment. There was one other ship in the Olympic class trio. Olympic obviously was first, and it is the class leader. Titanic was the second. The third ship in this series was the HMHS Britannic. Again, basically identical to both Olympic and Titanic. However, Britannic never served as a passenger liner, unlike its two sisters. Basically, immediately after Britannic was completed, it was requisitioned by the Royal Navy to be used as a hospital ship. But we'll get into that a little bit later on. First off, what is it that we're actually looking at here on these two ships? Well, we're looking at two examples of the great ocean liners of the early 20th century. We'll give you the specs on RMS Olympic, as it is closest to us and essentially identical to Titanic and the unpictured sister here, Britannic. Olympic. It was ordered by the White Star Line from the Harland and Wolff shipyards in Belfast, Ireland, for the cost of $7.5 million in 1909 dollars. That comes out to $195.1 million in today's money. So these were incredibly expensive projects back in the day, but you'll see why they don't want to spare any expense. Olympic. The keel was laid down on the 16th of December 1908. The hull was completed to the point where the ship could be launched, as in put in the water, on October 20th, 1910. Fitting out was completed in dry dock as well as just docked in the harbor there on May 31st, 1911. The ownership of Olympic was transferred from the Harland and Wolff shipyard to the White Star Line also on May 31st, 1911, and Olympic had its maiden voyage, its first trip with passengers in revenue service on the 14th of June, 1911. Olympic ended up having a very long and illustrious career, being in service from 1911 to 1935, basically 24 years at sea for the Olympic. In its time, it would obviously serve as a passenger liner, as we see it outfitted here, but at the outbreak of World War I, Olympic was requisitioned by the Royal Navy, where it was used as a troop transport, and it shuttled British, French, and American soldiers between the continents in and out of the war zone in Europe. Of course, for these purposes, Olympic was repainted in what they call a dazzle camouflage livery, which unfortunately we don't have pictured here, but basically it was unchanged from its passenger liner specification in terms of its capabilities and things like that. During its service as a warship, effectively, Olympic actually did gain the distinction of being the only passenger liner ever documented to score a kill on an enemy ship. Olympic rammed a German U-boat and sunk it. So Olympic, in addition to being a stalwart passenger liner, actually had some pretty prestigious wartime accomplishments as well. Olympic's long life actually did give it the nickname Old Reliable. Talking about Titanic, on the other hand, well, Titanic effectively identical to Olympic. On account of gross tonnage, Titanic slightly larger, therefore Titanic did ultimately gain the distinction of largest ship afloat at the time of its launch in 1911 as well. However, we have ourselves basically the same thing as Olympic. Titanic, though, it did not have nearly as long a service life. Titanic's in-service lifespan lasts from the 10th of April 1912 to the 14th of April 1912, just 4 days after it left Southampton, England on its maiden voyage between Europe and the Americas. Titanic, quite famously, struck an iceberg about 400 miles to the southeast of Newfoundland, Canada, and it would sink only about 2.5 hours thereafter. Out of 2,228 people on board, there or thereabout, 1,500 died, 705 or so survived. They evacuated in the lifeboats, and they awaited rescue by another British steamer, Carpathia, which arrived at the wreck site about 4 hours after Titanic sank early in the morning on the 15th of April, ship's time. Of course, the story of the Titanic makes its sister ships much more famous as well. Olympic, as we said, it had pretty much an unencumbered life. It did its job as a passenger liner, it served its country honorably and quite valiantly in the First World War, and then it lived out the rest of its life once again as a passenger liner, eventually being pulled out of service in 1935, and thereafter it was scrapped in Scotland. It is a shame that none of the Olympic-class ships survived today. The final member of the trio in the Olympic class, Britannic, was also, again, serving in World War I. It struck a mine in the Kea Channel off of Greece in 1916, and it also sank, much like its sister Titanic. However, Britannic, a wartime wreck, so different situations applying there, still not quite as famous as the Titanic, although being essentially identical to its two sister ships. In terms of technical specifications on these ships, the specs look a little bit like this. These are the specs on the Olympic. Gross tonnage, which is a measure of the displacement of water generated by a ship as it's put in the water. In 1911, as it was launched, Olympic had a gross tonnage of 45,324. Following the Titanic disaster, when Olympic had some more lifeboats added, the gross tonnage increased after 1913 to 46,358, and then after Olympic's final refit in 1920, the gross tonnage was finally 46,439. So these ships, yes, quite large for their day, but a typical cruise ship nowadays, and there is a pretty important distinction between cruise ships and ocean liners. These are ocean liners. They were not cruise ships in the sense that we think of cruise ships today, but the average cruise ship today has a gross tonnage of 100,000, if not even higher than that. So in terms of perspective, in terms of the amount of actual mass that these ships actually had. These ships are roughly 50% the size of a modern cruise ship. So even though these ships had a length of 882 feet 6 inches, and they were 92 feet 9 inches wide and 175 feet tall from the keel to the tops of the funnels, quite large, they are quite small compared to what sorts of ships are roaming the seas nowadays. In terms of other specifications there, they had a draft when they were laden of 34 feet 9 inches. Draft is the amount of space taken up from the surface of the water to the bottom of the ship, so when the ship is in the water. Generally, you can get a sense of that draft from looking at the red paint here on the bottom section of the hull. They had 9 decks, 8 passenger decks, and then 1 additional deck for the crew only. That's also generally where all of the machinery was, the engines, the steering gear, the cargo holds, and food stores, and things like that. Powering these ships. We mentioned earlier that these were steam ships. Indeed they are. The installed power on Olympic, and this would also be true for Titanic as well as Britannic, were 24 double-ended boilers, Scotch boilers as they are officially known. So steam engines, you got to boil water using fire to generate steam to supply to the engines. So 24 double-ended boilers, 5 single-engine boilers, and these fed steam into 2 4-cylinder triple expansion steam engines. These are piston reciprocating engines, obviously. Each of those engines produced 15,000 horsepower, and they ran 2 outboard propellers, as we can see here on the back of Olympic. We can see 2 propellers on the port, that's the left side, and on the starboard side, that's the right side, another propeller. And then there was a single low-pressure turbine engine, which drove the center propeller, as you can see here on Olympic. That was producing 59,000 horsepower. So these ships had a lot of power, but 3 engines on both the Olympic and the Titanic. As we mentioned, those engines drove propellers. The 3-bladed wing propellers here, made of bronze, run by the piston engines, and then the center propeller driven by the turbine engine. On Olympic, you can see that the center propeller there is 4-bladed versus the 3-bladed wing propellers. If we go over here on Titanic, we're going to play with a little bit of controversy. This is the rear of Titanic, and you can see the same 3 propellers, but we have 3 triple-bladed propellers here installed on Titanic. Little controversy about this. Nobody is entirely sure how many blades were on Titanic's center propeller. We have pictures of Olympic's propellers. We can prove that Olympic had a 4-bladed central propeller, but here on Titanic, that is not known. Titanic was only around for a very short time. Therefore, its stern section and its propellers, as far as we know, were never photographed. And any records that would indicate the orders in terms of casting the propellers have been lost since. Therefore, we don't know how many blades were on Titanic's center propeller. If I had to guess, I would say it would have been a 4-bladed propeller, quite like Olympic. However, at the Titanic wreck site, this section of the ship is buried under the mud. Therefore, we can't see that center propeller even today. Regardless, these ships, absolutely phenomenal bits of history, not just because of what happened to Titanic, but it's a very interesting thing to think about the microcosm of society at this time. Remember, we're right at the beginning of the second decade of the 20th century here, 1910 to 1920. Olympic beginning its career in 1911, Titanic in 1912, and Olympic going all the way up into the 1930s in that 24-year seafaring career. Absolutely brilliant record on the part of Olympic. You just think about how society has evolved between 1912 and today. These ships were absolutely the pinnacle of technology as far as transportation was concerned. They were fitted with steam engines. They were fitted with electric lighting. They had wireless telegraphs installed, and these were actually among some of the first ships to receive wireless telegraphs, meaning that they could transmit and receive radio messages in the middle of the ocean if there was another ship close enough to be in range of their antennas. Absolutely incredible. No expenses were spared. As a microcosm of where the Western world in general was at this time, these 2 ships are absolutely marvelous to study and get a sense of the kinds of things that they were doing. Who would have been on ships like these? We'd be talking about immigrants. The first mass wave of immigration to the United States in particular from about 1880 to about 1920, guess who would have come over on ships like these? A lot of those immigrants. Speaking of people like that, the people management on board these ships is quite different from the sorts of social norms that we would expect today. The Olympic and Titanic, and had it entered passenger service Britannic, were all run on a class system in terms of how their passenger spaces were allocated. There were 3 classes of passengers on board. They sold 3 types of tickets to the public. There was first class, second class, and third class. Remember, this is the end of the Victorian era. We're getting into Edwardian society here, at least in terms of Britain. We still have the very austere, the very prim and proper motifs of the 19th and really the 18th century still permeating society now at the beginning of the 20th century. Everything was meant to be in a certain way. You had to act in a given way in public. You had to interact with different classes of people, different statuses of people in very prescribed, very polite and civil manners. And of course, all of this carried over into the design and operation of ships like these. Your first class passengers, they were your highest paying customers. These people were your millionaires. They were your John D. Rockefellers of the world, for example. Their accommodations were incredibly lavish. They had free reign of the entire ship. They had things like room service, for example, via their cabin stewards. They had private decks that they could rent for the passage if they wanted. Basically, anything they wanted, they could have on this ship. The second-class passengers, they were basically your business class on a modern airliner. A second-class ticket, still quite expensive in those days dollars, but a second-class accommodation would have been reasonable. You might have had to share a room with 2 or 3 people, depending on with whom you were traveling. Families, of course, would have been kept together if at all possible. If you were a single traveler, though, you probably were going to have to bunk with somebody who was about to become your best friend for the next 7 days. But the second-class facilities, they also had quite reasonable accommodations. There was a gymnasium that they could use in addition to the first-class passengers having use of a gymnasium. There was a swimming pool. There was a squash court on board. There's a reading and writing room and a smoking lounge and things like that. And of course, there's a very nice dining hall where you would have all of your major meals of the day served. So a second-class passenger still has pretty reasonable accommodations, and I don't think that too many people would really complain about it even today. Third-class passengers, however, also known as steerage, and they are known as steerage because quite often on many ships, the third-class accommodations were located in the rear section of the ship near the steering gear. Therefore, steerage. Third-class passengers, on the White Star Line, they were also treated quite well by those standards of the day. They would have had rooms. They would have been sharing rooms in most cases, typically with 5 or 6 people in bunks, but they would have had their own dining hall. They would have had lounges that they could use. They had open deck space here also on the stern section. That's the rear section of the ship. But they wouldn't have had the amenities of first or second class. For example, it's not likely they would have been allowed to use the onboard swimming pool or the squash court or play deck games up here on the uppermost deck, known as the boat deck. But still, they would have had 3 meals a day, plus light refreshments whenever they wanted them available for purchase. They would have had an area for children to play. They would have had a library at their disposal. So still, even in third class, although you are sort of segregated to the rear section of the ship and you're not necessarily allowed to go anywhere else on board, still, compared to living in poverty in Europe, as a lot of these people were, a lot of your third class passengers were immigrants from Europe trying to get over to America, your passage on board Olympic or Titanic would have been a rather enjoyable experience. So, although you are dealing in this class structure, this very regimented and very prescribed sort of social dynamic, still, the experience on board a ship like this, no matter who you were, was reasonably tolerable. Perhaps a modern audience might not like the idea of having to share a room with a few strangers, but that's how it was done back then, and social norms have sort of changed a little bit, and in some regards we still do this. Think of university dormitories. You're sharing a room with strangers, at least at first. So we still do some of these things even today. Getting away from the history now, let's talk about these models for the sake of being models. Of course, the Titanic Honor and Glory guys, they just recently put these into production, and of course, the instant I saw them available, I've been following these developers developing this game for quite a while now, but the instant that I saw these ships go on the market and they were available for purchase, absolutely had to put my orders in. These models are interesting in the way that they're produced. They're actually 3D printed, and they are the first 3D printed objects that I have ever actually seen up close and personal. So very interesting for me just from that perspective as well, to get a sense of what actually is possible to achieve nowadays with 3D printing. But as you can see here, the detail on these models is actually quite good. Of course, I'm a lifelong Titanic Olympic class enthusiast, so I know what I'm looking at, and I'm sure if you're watching this video by this point, you certainly are too, if you're still interested. So, yes, you will notice, quite obviously, there are some details which have been omitted in the main casting of the model, the most important one of which is we don't have masts or rigging on either one of these ships. That's simply done due to the size restrictions of doing this in 1/1000th scale. But in the boxes that these models come in, you are given very, very small 3D printed masts, both forward and aft masts, that you can install on these ships in their supplied little holes here on the deck here. Here is our forward mast mounting point, and then here in the aft section, there you go, the other mounting point for the mast. So masts are provided with both the Olympic and Titanic, but they're very small, and as you can see here, I've chosen not to install them on either ship simply because, well, they're really small, and I'm quite afraid that I'll break them. So we're not going to display these with the masts, but they are available if you do want them. In any regard, though, let's just take a little bit of a closer look at the finer details on both of these ships, and also talk a little bit about how you can tell Titanic and Olympic apart. They are, of course, identical ships built basically concurrently, but there are some ways you can tell these two apart. Taking a look here at Olympic, very nice detail going on here. I was very hesitant. I was trying to temper my expectations a bit in terms of these models being 3D printed. I had never really seen 3D printing before, at least not up close. I've never held anything that was 3D printed, so I really didn't know what to expect in terms of the standard of detail that I could expect to see. But I am very pleasantly surprised with both of these models. Of course, these two ships basically identical, so if you look at one, you get a very good sense of how the other looks. But it's very, very nicely put together. Here on the starboard forward hull of Olympic, you can see that we do have individual portholes cast into the 3D printed model here, and then of course getting up toward the forecastle deck, that is the forward deck here on the bow section of the ship. More portholes there, outlining which would have been the crew quarters on board both ships. Toward the well deck, you can see very smooth lines, hull lines coming down from that enclosed area of sea deck, coming down to the well deck. We have representations of the cargo cranes here on both Olympic and Titanic, as well as some of the capstans that you could see where ropes and other rigging would have been manipulated, and the hatches as well. Your number 1, number 2, and number 3 cargo hatches there are represented quite nicely on both ships. Moving aft, here we get into the superstructure of Olympic. You can see we have the sea deck fully enclosed there, except for the forecastle, and then you can get to B deck, the B deck promenade, and then the A deck promenade here. Here we have the wheelhouse, the navigation bridge, where the ship would have been navigated from. Very nicely put together, I must say. This is all, of course, 3D printed in one piece, but the amount of detail that they're able to get into is quite impressive. I'm very pleased with all of that. Moving your rears, back toward the wheelhouse there. and then onto the boat deck, the top deck here on board Olympic. Very nicely done. Very, very nicely done. See some representations of the lifeboats running from fore to aft here. Should also mention that Olympic is shown in its 1911-1912 configuration. Of course, following the Titanic disaster, one of the reasons why so many people were lost on board Titanic was because there were insufficient lifeboats for all on board. So Olympic was later retrofitted with more lifeboats, effectively running the entire length of the boat deck. But here you can see Olympic just outfitted with the 20 boats that Titanic also was outfitted with when it launched in 1912. Moving aft on the boat deck, first of all, go back forward a little bit. Here is the dome over the grand staircase, the forward grand staircase anyway. That's a big stairwell which traverses almost the entire height of the enclosed area of the ship. You can also see in this section the deck houses, which were housing areas like the officers' quarters, the radio room, things of that nature. Also, you can see renditions of the 2 collapsible lifeboats at the base of the first funnel. Moving rear toward midships, you can see here that we have got ourselves the ship's compass. Not the most highly detailed thing in the world, but it's clearly identifiable. You know what it is. Moving aft, there is the third funnel and the deck house at the base of the third funnel. The aft grand staircase and the smoking room there with its ventilation, linking it up with the base of the third funnel. And then here, the fourth funnel, and at the rear here of the boat deck, the second class staircase. That's what we're looking at here in this deck house, the top of the second class staircase, and that would go all the way down into the ship down to F deck, which is the lowest passenger deck. Very cool, I must say. Continuing to move aft toward the poop deck here, back on the open decks, the A deck promenade here at the rear, and then moving down to B deck and C deck for the well deck, and then the poop deck proper. Very nice detail. Again, it is not nearly as detailed as some build-it-yourself plastic models here with the injection molded plastic, but for something that is 3D printed, I must say this is very, very cool. We have more representations of the cargo cranes here on the aft section of the ship. We have also got the auxiliary docking bridge here on the poop deck. Again, this is there for sight lines in case they were coming into a relatively narrow slipway, and the sight lines from the bridge here at the forward end, the navigating bridge, were insufficient. You could get crew members here on the aft deck here, and then you could just help to guide the ship into port that way. Very, very cool. Of course, looking at Titanic, you can see that we have very similar details on Titanic because these are sister ships built effectively identically. But same sorts of details available here on Titanic. Slightly different in terms of the colors that we're seeing. The wheelhouse roof here on Titanic is painted gray. On Olympic, I'm not sure if you've noticed, but it is white on board Olympic, as you can see there. Yep, white roof on Olympic, gray roof here on Titanic. Also, another detail on Titanic, the A-deck promenade there on Titanic. The forward section basically going down to midships. That is all closed. That's enclosed on Titanic. It is open on Olympic, as we can see here looking at Olympic here from the port side. Open A-deck promenade for the entire length of the ship. On Titanic, it's been enclosed to midships roughly, and then it's open from midships aft. So that is probably the most obvious way to tell Titanic and Olympic apart in photographs. And again, very few photographs existing from the time that Olympic and Titanic would have been serving together. The ships were actually photographed together on a couple of occasions, of course, before Titanic set sail on its first and only transatlantic trip. But Titanic had yet to be modified in this way to enclose the forward promenade deck there. So Titanic was still being fitted out in Belfast and actually Southampton before it took off on its trip across the Atlantic for the first time. They were still enclosing the A-deck promenade there in the forward section, and Olympics remained open. The reason why they enclosed that promenade deck was because passengers on Olympic had complained about the wind and sea spray on the forward area of that deck, so they enclosed that for Titanic, and Britannic also featured that same enclosure on the forward end of the A-deck promenade. Interestingly enough, though, Olympic never received that modification. Olympic had an open promenade deck for its entire career, despite the complaints of the sea spray. So, interesting to note. And of course, on a completely puerile point, those of you who may believe that Titanic and Olympic were switched and Olympic was actually sunk instead of Titanic due to a conspiracy for insurance money, well, Olympic never received that A-deck promenade modification, and the ship that's on the bottom of the North Atlantic has an enclosed A-deck promenade. That ship on the bottom is Titanic. Thank you very much. In any regard, as you can see, the great detail on both ships does carry on for their entire length. What I do also like is just looking at the black section of the hull. You can, in addition to seeing the portholes represented, you can see that we do have hatches also being represented here on the side of the hull there. Little doors along the D-deck area that would have swung open to service gangways and things like that in port, and also in the event that another ship had to come alongside at sea, such as a tender. If you're in a port that's too shallow to dock in, you'd open up hatches along the side there too, and you'd transfer people on and off both ships. The little tender that you see here represented is Nomadic, SS Nomadic. Nomadic, it was a little tender ship powered by 2 steam engines, and it's about 250 feet long, believe it or not. You can see how it's dwarfed here next to Titanic, but Nomadic, actually a pretty decently sized ship in its own right. It was a tender that worked Cherbourg, France for most of its career, servicing the Olympic-class ships, both Olympic and Titanic, the one time that Titanic actually did make it to Cherbourg before going across the Atlantic to its destiny. But Nomadic, it had a very long career. It serviced the Olympic all the way up until it exited service and was scrapped in 1935, but Nomadic, believe it or not, still exists. Nomadic is the only White Star vessel that does still exist today. It is among the oldest passenger vessels in the world, and you can even go visit it. It is at the Titanic Museum in Belfast, Ireland nowadays, where it has undergone a complete restoration and reconstruction. It's been restored back to the way that it would have been at the beginning of its career in the early 1900s. So if you want to get a sense of what Olympic and Titanic might have been like to be on, you can still do that if you go to Belfast and go on board the SS Nomadic. It's a very cool thing, and of course there are plenty of videos on YouTube that people have taken from on board Nomadic. They don't sail it. I do believe it is seaworthy, but they don't actually put it in the water. It's permanently dry docked in Belfast, but it is, as far as I know, seaworthy, and it could actually go out and run if they wanted it to. It's very, very cool, great little piece of history. In other regards, though, very, very nice models, I must say. They were only about $40, $45 a piece, so okay, maybe for something that is this size, it's 1/1000th scale, they're about 10 inches long, but I really like them. And they've also, the Titanic Honor and Glory guys, they've also recently announced that they're ready to sell the HMHS Britannic as well in this same scale. And yeah, I've got an order out for that as well. So hopefully we'll have the complete Olympic class trio before too long. But really, I'm quite pleased with both the Olympic and Titanic for the moment. It's very, very cool. We'll take a little bit of a closer look at each of these models. We'll take them off of the stands, which are also 3D printed, show you the underside and some more close-up details. Alright, we've gotten the ships off of the stands now, but speaking of the stands, just want to show you very quickly, these are the stands that you get, and it's obviously the one for Olympic. The one for Titanic has the same mounting post, but it has a third one for Nomadic, as you can see. But it is 3D printed out of what looks to be a single piece. Very cool. You can see the weave of the filament there going through the bottom section. So yep, they are 3D printed. Not very heavy. Actually, the stands are a little bit heavier than the ships themselves, but that just gives you an idea of what the stands are. The ships, we'll take a look at Olympic. Very light. They are not quite hollow inside, but they're very, very light. They don't deform or flex or anything as you hold them in your hand, so they're built reasonably solidly, but again, they are just plastic. They're PLA, but yeah, you be careful with them, but at the same time, they could take a little bit of bumping around, I suppose. Here on the bottom, there we go, Titanic Honor and Glory. This is number 62, and the person who does these out of Florida. His name is Zeno Silva, and he's done a great job. I don't know if he's actually designed the files, the CAD files that get printed, or if he just does the printing and the painting, but he's done a great job on these nonetheless. Again, you can see that this is a full model of the ship. It's not a waterline model. There is a bottom section of the hull fully modeled, including the little bump there going down from the peak of the bow down to the bottom of the ship there. There's no real representation of the bilge keel on either ship, but again, you can see what we're talking about. Very, very nicely put together. And of course, they are painted top and bottom, and believe it or not, inside and out. The mounting studs here on the stands would go into these holes. They are painted inside as well. Very, very nicely done. A little bit better of a look at the wings, where the port and starboard propellers are mounted. Very cool. And then the center propeller as well. Very nice. Also, these are hand painted. They're not different layers of printed plastic in different colors as far as I know, so they are hand painted. You can see that we have the gold stripe running down that demarcation line between the black section of hull and the white superstructure. Very nice. Again, this is showing Olympic as it was in about 1912. After Olympic's final refit, they moved that gold stripe down a little bit to about the level of the anchor that you can see. So Olympic looks a little bit different in the last years of her life. But here, in its original livery, it would look like this. Very cool. Another aspect of these ships is a concept called shear, and it's an apparent curvature, usually downward curvature, of particularly the superstructures of these ships as you look at them from fore to aft, when you look at them across the longitudinal axis. So we'll just take a look at this here. Is there any apparent shear present on Olympic? It's a little difficult to see on camera, but if you look down the side there, you can see that the front section of the ship, the bow section of the ship, does not quite line up with midships. And again, trying my best to get focus down there, and it's not quite working. But there is apparent shear on both of these ships. Now looking at Titanic, and shear is also apparent to my eye anyway. Again, camera, a little bit difficult to get it to focus there. But you can see an apparent curvature down at midship and then curving back up toward the aft section. So that's an architectural feature that is really not seen too much anymore in marine architecture, but something that these ships would have had, and as far as I can tell, present on both of these models. Very cool to see that little detail. I know many of you are probably interested in Nomadic as well. Talk about forgotten ships. Here it is. Nomadic, it was actually a discotheque restaurant in Paris for a long time, until the late 90s. It was completely dilapidated, and then finally it was purchased by a Titanic Historical Society in Ireland, and they got it back to Harland and Wolff in Belfast, who did a complete restoration on it. Absolutely fantastic. But here it is, also 1/1000 scale, very, very, very tiny. But yeah, decent detail going on with Nomadic as well. You can even see down into the hull a bit with the staircases going down into the ship. Very cool. Of course, these tenders, they just would have shuttled passengers from the shore to the ship if the ship could not dock in the port, if the draft of the ship was too much to get it into port, to get it to an actual dock. So they just would have been running shuttle service between shore and ship and vice versa. Nomadic, though, because it was designed primarily to carry the first-class passengers, it was also appointed quite luxuriously. It would have had a nice sitting area. It would have had an area for dining, things like that. But again, people would not have been on board Nomadic for more than maybe half an hour just trying to get out to the ship. But still, they wanted people to be comfortable, and you can see a lot of those interior fittings still on board Nomadic to this day. Very, very nice. I must say, though, that is basically all she wrote in terms of our looks at these models. Do let me know if there is anything else about these that you would like to see, anything that I've not covered. I've intentionally not really gone into the story of either ship because, well, we're really focusing on the models. But if you would like me to talk more about the story of either Olympic or Titanic or even Britannic, and again, I do have that model on the way, but I don't know when it might arrive, but you will see it at some point. Let me know. there's anything you want me to cover, I'd be glad to do it at some point. Just let me know in the comments. Until next time, though, I would like to thank you all very much for watching. FerrariMan601 saying thank you. Do check out the Titanic Honor and Glory website, and definitely, if you want to buy these models, those guys would appreciate it quite a bit. The proceeds from these models will go straight back into developing the absolutely wonderful video game that they've been working on for years now. So consider giving those guys a little bit of support. Till next time, thank you for watching. FerrariMan601 saying thanks, and we will see you soon.